One challenge of using multiple color spaces is transforming from one color space to another. This is especially challenging if the gamuts don't match. For example, if you transform from a narrow gamut to a wide gamut, or a wide gamut to a narrow gamut. Such is the case with going from SDR to HDR, or HDR to SDR. If you go from a narrow gamut to a wide gamut, then part of that wide gamut may not be used. Or you have to figure out how to expand the narrow gamut to fill the wide gamut. And you have to do that in such a way that you maintain your aesthetic integrity, where the shadows, midtones, and highlights are consistent between the color spaces. If you go from a wide gamut to a narrow gamut, it's even more problematic. You have two choices there. Either you clip some of the values and throw them away, so you only fit a small part of the wide gamut within the narrow gamut. Or you compress the wide gamut to fit within the narrow gamut. But again, you have to do it in such a way that you maintain your aesthetic integrity, where the shadows, midtones, and highlights are consistent. Resolve 17 makes that process a bit easier by adding additional tone mapping controls to the RCM system. And tone mapping maps one color space to another while trying to maintain the integrity of the result. The goal would be to keep the majority of values the same within the center of the gamuts and compress the shadows and highlights so they maintain visual quality. Earlier versions of Resolve did have tone mapping controls, but they're much improved with 17. Let's take a look. Going back to the RCM Wide Gamut project, we'll go to the project settings. It's set to Wide Gamut with an output of Rec 709. I'll change the preset to Custom so we can see all the menus. And here is an input and output DRT menu. And DRT stands for Display Rendering Transform. In other words, tone mapping. When are these applied? Well, the order of events is the output color space transform is applied to the incoming clip. The result of that is fed into the input DRT for tone mapping. The result of the input DRT is sent to the timeline color space transform. Then the timeline color space is sent to the output DRT for another round of tone mapping. The result of the output DRT is then fed into the output color space for final rendering. So tone mapping occurs before and after the timeline. A good way to see this working is to look at HDR footage within the SDR color space. And to start, I'll turn these input and output DRT menus to none, which means there's no tone mapping. And then I'll set the timeline color space to Rec 709. And I'll leave the output color space set to the same, and click Save. The two clips here are actually HDR. So we have HDR clips within the SDR timeline being output to SDR. And overall, it looks okay. However, you may notice that the lamps are completely clipped and become pure white. What's going on there? One way to see what's going on with the values is to go to the scopes. There's a button for that right here. And I'll make sure it's set to the waveform scope. And I'll leave it set to 10-bit. You can switch to scale right here through the triple dot menu. Waveform scale style, 10-bit. So if you look closely, you can see that the lamps are here and here in the waveform, and they're being clipped. You can see a hard line there at the top of those regions. So odds are the values are going past that up into the HDR space. And without tone mapping, it's just cut, and they become pure white there. If you use tone mapping, though, we can recover some of that detail. Go back to the project settings, and I'll return input DRT and output DRT to DaVinci, which is the default style of tone mapping. I'll move the dialog aside so we can take a look at the lamps here, and then watch the waveform. I'll click Save. They're no longer clipped, and detail returns to those areas. And you'll see the very tops of those peaks pulled back down into the valid range. Let's go back to the project settings. Now you could manually grade this to get similar results, but the automatic tone mapping can save you time and energy. DaVinci is one style of tone mapping, but there are others you can try. The simple mode is designed for HDR to SDR conversion, although with this demonstration, it produces rougher results, but worth a try. Luminance mapping is similar to DaVinci, but can be more accurate, and it's better suited for projects where all the clips are using the same color space. For example, perhaps all your clips are using Rec 2020. Again, DaVinci is the default, and in particular it tries to give you a smooth transition from the compressed shadows to the midtones, and the midtones to the compressed highlights. Now, DaVinci and luminance mapping have a tendency to desaturate in some situations, so if you do want to preserve your saturation, there's a tone map setting just for that, saturation preserving. So there is some flexibility here with your tone mapping options in terms of both the input and the output DRTs. Now, in terms of the maximum luminance, once you switch over to custom, you'll see a timeline working luminance. And because we are using Rec 709 as our timeline color space, it's set to 100 nits as the maximum. And that would be the standard for SDR. And hence the top of the waveform equates to 100 nits. Now, if you're using the HDR space, you can choose a higher nit threshold. Keep in mind, no matter what this is set to, that'll be the maximum luminance that's available to the output color space, regardless of what that color space is set to. Speaking of HDR, let's see what happens if we have an SDR clip within an HDR space. I'll go ahead and set the timeline color space to Rec 2100 ST2084. And I'll set the output color space to the same. And then for now, I'll turn off the input and output DRTs. There is a special option here, use inverse DRT for SDR to HDR, which will come into play here. So for now, I'm going to turn it off so we can see the difference. Uncheck this, and then turn the input and output to none, and then save. And now we'll have an HDR timeline with an HDR output. Let's import an SDR clip. Turn to the Media tab, Import, and I've added a new shot for this test, and that's named Model ProRes. Open up that, and this is a compressed ProRes shot that was originally graded for Rec 709, so I'm going to double check the input color space. And here it's selected Rec 709 scene for us. Just as a test, I'll set it to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4, see if there's any significant difference. And it looks the same, so I think we're good with that. Let's add this to the timeline and go to the color tab. So again, we have an SDR shot on the HDR timeline being output to HDR. Now, of course, the result looks very flat. It's ungraded for the space, and of course, we'd have to look at this on the HDR monitor. But we can use tone mapping to help us get a bit closer to a good result. The scope's set to 10-bit, but let's go ahead and switch over to a nit scale. We can switch the waveform scale style to HDR, which reads out nits, 0 to 10,000. Let's take a look at our project settings. And here the timeline working luminance is set to HDR 1000. That's fairly common, so I'll leave it set to that. Let's turn back on our tone mapping. I'll go back to DaVinci for input and output, and make sure the use inverse DRT for SDR to HDR is turned on. And what that will do is lift the values so they better fill the HDR space. So in other words, the SDR values are expanded to better take advantage of that large HDR space. Turn it on and pay close attention to the waveform here to see what happens. Save that. After a moment, you'll see that the waveform is expanded. You can see it's not that much brighter here in the view, but the peaks have definitely moved up in the waveform. Now, of course, you're still free to grade, but that's an extra step to help you get a bit closer automatically. There's one other option we could take a look at. Let's say we're going from SDR to HDR and then back to SDR. I'll set the output back to Rec 709. Once you have that combination of settings, you'll see that there is a new option. Use 203 nits reference for Rec 2100 HDR. This is designed for using SDR footage within the HDR space to help further expand the SDR to better use the HDR space, making the SDR and HDR clips a bit more equivalent. I'll go ahead and turn that on and save. If you watch the waveform, once again the waveform is expanded and the highlights are pushed even farther up. So it's a bit closer to matching HDR clips within that HDR timeline. It's not mandatory to use it, but again, a nice automatic way to get things a bit closer together. So there we go, input DRTs and output DRTs. Great way to have more control over tone mapping so you can mix SDR and HDR clips on SDR and HDR timelines with SDR and HDR outputs. We've now reached the end of this updated course on color management in DaVinci Resolve. I want to thank you for joining me. I'd encourage you to visit the forums at lowpost.com where you can ask and answer questions on the topics we discussed here. I'd also encourage you to visit lowpost.com to check out other tutorials on similar topics, such as visual effects work in Resolve. Once again, I want to thank you for joining me and have fun with your color work in Resolve.